Well, I think that there are quite a few factors that most people are not aware of. One of them is that this is basically an extension of Enron. And if people remember, Enron was one of the world's leading energy companies back in the late 1990s. They were very innovative. They called themselves the smartest guys in the room. And of course, it collapsed into ashes and dust in a huge bankruptcy because it turned out that they were calculating a lot of their profitability on sort of an off-books accounting method where they were calculating future profits as if present. And a lot of it was based on wind subsidies, the flow-through shares, the renewable energy certificates and all that. So when it collapsed, there's a lot of big philanthropies and a lot of big institutional investors who either were already into those markets or who found it very interesting. Like one of the trusts of Enron was called the Osprey Trust, I believe it was, and they had a 23% return in 1 year. Now, of course, you only get that because you're manipulating the books, because very few companies ever have that kind of return on investment. So you have to realize that all the major pension funds in the world, all the government pension funds in the world, have suffered a number of hits over the years. The real estate crisis, the dot-com collapse, the 2008 subprime mortgage, and on and on and on. So a lot of them have huge unfunded liabilities. Like CalPERS is one that's fairly well known. It's the California Pension Retirement System for public employees. And they have something like $100 billion unfunded pension liability. In the meantime, since the 1970s, unions have become shareholders of corporations. And a fellow named Peter Drucker, who was considered to be the management expert in the world in the probably the 1970s to 90s, he wrote a book called Pension Fund Socialism. And he predicted that most of the corporations in North America would become owned by union pension funds within the next 10 or 20 years. And that is what happened. So what does that got to do with climate, you ask? Well, in 2005, an organization called the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment was formed. This was formed by most of the major pension funds of the world. The idea, sounds good, that you have responsible investment, that you're not putting your money into, say, is it the Congo where all the children are mining cobalt?
Yeah, I mean it's occurring all over Africa, but yeah, I believe the Congo is part of that.
Right. So, that you're not going to be investing there, that you're going to maintain some kind of corporate social responsibility. So the idea sounds good. But what in effect happened is they ended up drawing together about 1,000 big pension funds and institutional investors who have assets under management of $100 trillion. They then set out these ESG guidelines, and part of that includes diversity, equality, and inclusion. And they started swaying public policy. Like up until that time, all these institutional investors, they just put their money where they thought the best returns would come from. But then that started changing because they became activist investors, and they became absolute activist investors after the Montreal Pledge, which was done in 2014, where they actively pledged to go to governments and corporations who were climate laggards and tell them to get on board. So it could be that at that time, people really thought, that wind and solar and renewables and all that would lead to this, the net zero, the zero marginal cost society. Now, this book is probably one of the most influential books out there, and this is probably why people like Stephen Guilbeault, Catherine McKenna actually think that the unicorn world is possible.
Hmm.
Now, this fellow, Jeremy Rifkin, this has been translated to about 36 different languages. He proudly brags on Amazon that he is responsible for German energy policy, which, they're now in despair
Yeah.
and in heat or eat poverty. So anyway, the point being that this UNPRI, they also adopted Al Gore as their fiduciary guru. They started manipulating markets because they have so much financial power. So, and also governments. So there's actually a book by Adam Harms, who's a professor in one of the Ontario universities. I think it might be Western. He wrote a book called Unseen Power: How Mutual Funds Can Actually Sink Whole Jurisdictions because of their investment decisions. So, if you look at Canada, for instance, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, they're very into renewables. It's a huge fund. They have, I think, 300,000 members. CUPE, very into green. They have 600,000 members. Unifor, not sure what their membership is, but it is in the hundreds of thousands. Also very into renewables. So you have these bodies that they can go to governments and banks and say, hey, get on board with the Paris Agreement, which one of them did that I know of for sure, or we'll pull our money. You see, you can go to any corporation. You can go to your oil sands corporation, right? If you're an investor there and say, listen, we want you to invest in wind and solar. So maybe the CEO would go, no, really, I want to stick with our core business. That's what we know. And they go, well, I guess you don't have to be CEO. And he's like, you're right. And they go, we give dividends and benefits to people who think this is a good idea. Well, there's not many jobs for CEOs out there, right? And a wind farm, what's that, $150 million when you're dealing with multi-billion-dollar projects in oil and gas? Sure, we'll build a wind farm. We don't mind. Then we'll sell more gas. We'll sell more.
Right.
We'll sell more oil anyway, and we'll get all the renewable energy certificates. Anyway, these groups, as I was talking about, the UNPRI and the institutional investors. So now we've established they have tremendous power, financial power, and power of numbers. There's another organization called the CDP Worldwide. Now, they began about the same time as the UNPRI. It's a Rockefeller charity offshoot, and they began sending voluntary requests to corporations and cities and asking them to account for their carbon footprint. And most of them did in good faith. Well, what they would do is gather all those questionnaires. They'd give them to a big accounting firm like Accenture or PwC, Deloitte, and they would aggregate all the responses. And then they would come up with a big report that would be issued to the institutional investors who have the $100 trillion in assets under management, showing them who was a good or bad guy. And in fact, a number of their publications, I don't know if they still do it, but they literally had a black and white list. So you were on the white list if you were considered to be clean and green, and the black list if you didn't respond to their request. So, you can see why people in corporations would willingly comply with this voluntary request because they want investment. So, the irony is that if you look back to about the 1990s, late 1990s, I think Exxon was the top share, top in the stock market, the top company. And by 2007, I think it was, all the top 9 were high-tech companies. Why? Because they all projected this aura of being clean and green. Most of them also say we're 100% renewable. Well, that's drawn all the investors there. But in fact, none of those companies could exist without oil, gas, and coal, right? So that is a big lie, but it's all driven by the UNPRI, the CDP Worldwide, and now another group of influencers that would be all the big green philanthropies. They also formed in about 2005, 6, Climate Works. Climate Works was about the top 15 or so biggest philanthropies, most of them in the States. So you have Bloomberg, you have the, what is it, William and Mary Hewlett. I'm getting them all mixed up. Anyway, there's a whole list of them, and also Vivian Krause has been tracking them all. So these guys all got together and they worked with McKinsey, which is the world's largest management firm, and they came up with a thing called Design to Win, which is a plan to give money to local environmental groups to activate and agitate for policies that these guys want, but make it look like it's grassroots policy.
Mm.
So when you have things like the tar sands campaign, that was all funded for the most part from out of the country initially, millions of dollars in various provinces, not just Alberta. And you may say, well, why? Why are they doing all this? Their ultimate goal is to set up 2 global carbon trading systems. And ultimately, it will also come down to you and I having a personal carbon ration and trading in carbon credits. And what drives the carbon credit industry? Wind and solar. These generate the renewable energy certificates.